How's everybody doing? Nice. Great. That's great. So Angelica and I actually know each other. We've talked before. And I can tell you guys that she has an amazing story herself. So I just wanted to get started in, if you could share your journey and how you ended up at Brit & Co. and what you've been doing there since.
Yeah, so I will try to not take my whole 20 minutes. So I come from a creative background. I grew up always really interested in arts and storytelling and that type of thing. Went to a liberal arts school, edited a feminist art magazine and so on. And then afterwards, I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. So I traveled for about 2 years doing artist residencies around the world, including one that was a front for a cult, which is a whole different fireside chat. And then from there, kind of realized, okay, I need to do real life, and moved to New York, worked at an ad agency for about 3 years in the creative department, then went on to a startup called 20 by 200. And then basically my husband and I were like, we need to leave New York, we're ready to be outside, but we wanted to be in a city where our careers could still flourish, so we moved to San Francisco. And the first weekend I was there, I met Britt Morin. She was still working at Google at the time, but had her eyes on something in the future. And about 6 months after that meeting, she called me up and said, hey, you want to grab coffee? I just want to pick your brain about a creative project that I'm thinking about. And when I got to that coffee, she said, hey, do you want to quit your job and start this company with me? And that was Brit & Co. And so that's really the story of how I started there. When we started it just over 7 years ago, it was just the two of us, always with, the mission of inspiring women through creativity to really take action in every aspect of their lives. So I was brought on to really create the voice and the content. In my role now, I oversee the content teams, editorial, video, creative design, work closely with, sales and marketing, of course. And I sort of describe my role, I was saying to you earlier, as I'm like the keeper and stretcher of our voice. Our visual voice has to evolve over the years, so does our editorial one, based on the changing landscape of media and all the things we're working on. So that's my story.
Awesome. And actually, if I could see a show of hands, who is a business owner or a startup founder? Okay.
Hell yeah.
Great. Awesome. So in your experience working at a super early stage startup that has scaled tremendously, how have you seen the voice evolve? What have you held on to and what have you changed?
Yeah, so when we started the company, the roots were creativity. It was all about using online tools to get offline and make things with your hands. Britt and I both had this aha moment that, a lot of people, and particularly women, don't think of themselves as creative. They don't want to define themselves as an artist because they're like, oh, I don't know, I'm not a great painter or whatever. And our whole goal was, even if you only have 30 minutes, there's a way to bring creativity into your life. And, everyone's unique point of view is really valuable. So that's how it began. And then over the years, it really evolved to be about certainly the roots of creativity and finding your own path, but really about every aspect of your life, advancing in your career, taking a creative take on, your home, relationships even, wellness, health, all of this, has to do with that whole woman, and particularly women in their 20s and 30s as our audience. And so that's really how it's evolved. And I think the other piece of how it's evolved is, when we started, it was videos and online tutorials. And again, with the mission changing and even like social media changing, like Instagram didn't exist, or it did, but it was very early. How we bring that mission and story to life is really what's changed over the years through events and experiences, through retail, as well as, sticking with the heart of it, which is content.
Awesome. So, Brit & Co. is obviously a really story-first brand, and you have a really interesting story yourself. What would you say to the founder of, an IT startup that maybe doesn't have a super sexy story to share and isn't editorial first? How can they benefit from good storytelling?
Yeah, so when I think of storytelling around a brand, there's sort of a few pieces of it. So the first, of course, is your superhero origin story. So even if you've developed a super niche piece of software or hardware or some product that's for a very specific audience, there's likely a reason that you came up with it. Maybe a friend of yours was trying to solve some particular problem, or you were in a role. So there's the origin piece of it, and the fact that you wanted to save time, you want whatever that is. And I think you really want to hone in on that and find the mission that drove you, because even if it's not something that applies to everyone, like editorial content and that type of stuff, it applies to you. And for you to take this risk on yourself and the people that you hire and so on is a really good freaking story. And so origin story is part one. But once you've nailed that, it's how do you bring your voice and story to life on a daily and weekly basis with your audience, with your customers, instead of just having a about us page. How do you kind of stay alive and vibrant through your social channels, obviously, through a blog and that type of thing, but also through your community and them sharing their stories of how, whatever you've worked on has helped them in their business and so on.
Awesome. What's the biggest mistake you see brands making when it comes to content about their brand and their story?
So I think the biggest, there are a couple. So the first one I would say is I think it's easy to forget about the humanity of it all. And I know, there's one extreme version of it, which is like the age of the influencer. So let's put that aside and just say, which, I'm into, but the fact that you were solving a problem is really important. And I think people want to know that real people are the ones working on the things that they're using. So if it's software, if it's a game, if it's a notebook, they want to know that someone made that. And I feel like a lot of times brands want to talk in the royal we and feel like this big overarching company that's huge because you want to seem like a big deal. And that's not always relatable and authentic. And I think you can be a big deal and also be like a human being who made some mistakes along the way.
That's really, really interesting. That point that you're making, how really small startups will try to sound like they have a 500-person call, room, and
I mean, we definitely used the royal we at Brit & Co. at the beginning, and then it would just be like, it's just me and Brit here. Like, I'm shooting on my iPhone.
So, what would you say to brands that want to seem legit, but also want to connect with their audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that the confidence in the origin story and the mission and the different tools you want to create to bring it to life are legit. And the fact that, hey, I used this and this is what I was trying to solve for. Not this is like this far-fetched thing that I think might relate to people. Like, you need to have real testimonials. You need to work with, if you have 3 customers, get their stories, go visit them, like take them out to lunch and really understand that. And then that kind of just leads to the next part, which is the humanity of it and being really, like, people want to know what you're listening to on Friday afternoon when everyone's like scrolling through Instagram stories, kind of not doing work, and stuff like that.
So what do you think about, just coming back to the royal we, what do you think about a company blog that uses first person to tell stories? Is that appropriate?
So I think it's appropriate, but not all the time. So I think if you're announcing something like a new feature, I think we is great. I think there's a really great place for first-person narrative on company blogs and Medium pages and websites, whatever you want to call it. But you really want to call that out. Hey, I'm Ange. I'm the Chief Creative Officer here. Like, I have a toddler, and I'm going to share a little anecdote about blank, and really set it up so that it's not, you also don't want to bury it either way. Oh, this stopped. But I can talk. Well, okay, hello. So yeah, I would say use it wisely. And I think it's really, people love to hear from founders. They also love to hear from everyone else on the team. Maybe not everyone, meaning that they don't all want to write content and they need to be focused on their actual to-do list. But, if there are folks that are interested in content on your teams that aren't necessarily, they're not responsible for that at work, like, give them an opportunity to tell a story about something they were working on. Or I think it's really great to see things come alive, especially like on a company blog, even if you post twice a week or, whatever.
So that's really, really interesting also. What stage of a company's growth do you think is most important to invest in content and storytelling? You know, when do you bring on that first hire that's expressly devoted to storytelling?
Day one. No, obviously I'm biased, but I would say that you might not bring a hire on for a while, and it's so unique to whatever your company is. But I think thinking about storytelling from the start is important, and coming up with a cadence with which you want to tell that story. And again, like, it can just be on Twitter, it can just be on Instagram. You don't need to have a dedicated site. You don't need long form if you're not there yet. But I think, you know, it's really valuable. And again, when you have those few customers and like big fans, really reaching out to them and asking them to tell their story and so on. And, you know, I think never underestimate the power of a content calendar, even if you're not a content company. Like, just come up with guidelines for yourself.
In terms of guidelines, how specific do you need to get with kind of a editorial guidebook? I'm sure as you've scaled, it's been difficult at times to stay true to the voice while growing the team. How have you been able to build out that, you know, kind of those guidelines?
Yeah, so I mean, you know, obviously because we are an editorial first company, we have a style guide with, do we use the Oxford comma or not? The answer is yes. And those types of things. But as we explore new themes and topics that we want to cover, we do it mostly on an annual basis. There have been a few exceptions when something's been happening in the world, like elections of the past, where, you know, we decided to take on a whole new topic and a stance around supporting women more aggressively than we were doing so before. And so I think you just need to come up with, you know, is it quarterly that you revisit themes or the types of things you're talking about? You know, also I think creating an environment where feedback is really welcome and encouraged is important, because again, if you're not a content company and you're throwing this content up there, you have to be able to discuss it. You don't want to just have it up on the site and never speak of it again. It's like, what did we learn from this? Did people like it? Did we get, you know, thumbs ups? Did we get comments? Whatever it is you're looking for. And really evaluate and then say, okay, we really want to tell that story, but we didn't do it right. So what are 3 ways we could do it differently?
So how do you know when a story is getting traction? Aside from the obvious, you know, there's page views, but just kind of, how do you know when a campaign or a specific topic is really resonating with your audience?
Yeah, so I'd say aside from the sort of metric piece of it, so the more qualitative is how much the community engages in it. Do they share a story? I'll give you an example. So we launched a series last Valentine's Day, how appropriate, called Riding Solo. And it was all about, you know, women doing things on their own. It wasn't about being single. It was just about, you know, reclaiming that independence. And so we had different people tell first-person stories. One's a mom of 3, you know, one's a single person, and so on. And we had this outpouring of stories come in through Twitter and Instagram and so on, and we didn't even expect it. I mean, we say that all the time, like, share your blah with us, you know? And it was so cool because it really, really resonated with people. And they wanted to share their stories, and they wanted ideas for, like, how should I do a sunset hike on my own, like, if I don't have a car, you know, and these types of things. And it was really, really cool. So I think there's nothing better than hearing stories from the people that you are trying to reach about you affecting them.
So on the flip side, how do you decide, okay, there's something here, but we just didn't execute the story in the right way? How do you kind of, how do you bridge that gap and say, okay, we need to revisit this, but in a different way?
I think it so depends on the specific example, but I think, you know, whenever we're evaluating a story, again, as a content company, it's like, does this drive the brand? Does it drive traffic? And or is it a revenue-based goal, you know, if it's branded content or so on? And ideally, it's all 3, but at least it's 2 out of 3. And so I think, you know, when we're talking about stuff that's really true to your brand and those types of stories, you feel in your gut that you need to tell this story, and the whole team is on board. That's when you know you should keep figuring out how to tell the story. If you were doing it because you just thought it was going to kind of go viral, and that is true, like, you need traffic to be a successful content company, that's reality. and it just didn't, then maybe you move on. And it's like, maybe people don't care about the Instant Pot anymore. I don't know. They still do, by the way.
Can you give a specific example of something, your team thought was going to be huge and kind of flopped?
Yeah, so let me think about that one. Define flopped. Okay, I got it. So I would say this is when all you celebrate is the brand piece of it and not necessarily the traffic. So we did a beautiful series called Future Women of America that was all around profiling young women in their under 20 and under who are changing the world. And while we saw a ton of amazing community engagement and that type of thing, people were really, really stoked, it didn't bring in like the crazy traffic goals that we imagined. And I think doing it over again, we've thought about, instead of rolling it all out at once, we would roll it out chapter by chapter and really focus on each individual instead of the whole collection of 15 and that type of thing. So it's like really figuring out what are different ways of bringing it to life. Or maybe it should have been a podcast, mini-series or something like that. Like, what are other ways to tell those same stories?
So speaking of that, how do you approach distribution from day one? Like you said, if you're not getting any traffic, it's kind of like throwing things into a void. So what would you say to a company that's just starting out and just getting their feet wet in content? Where should they distribute first?
Yeah, so we always took a very distributed approach in terms of social. And so we focused a lot on Pinterest at the beginning, which makes sense. We were doing tutorials and recipes and that type of thing. But we always treated each channel differently. So if we're doing an Instant Pot roundup, what does it look like on Pinterest? What does it look like on Instagram? On Instagram, maybe we're gonna do like a 10-second video that's a time lapse of a recipe coming to life. On Twitter, it's just gonna be like, this is keto-friendly, paleo, blah, 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 whatever. And on Pinterest, you'll have the long form with photos. And so we would always treat each content and try to figure out how many legs can we give this thing and to appeal to the different audiences.
Very cool. I saw briefly that there was a question from the audience that I think was really good. So how do you, like you said, sometimes you just need content to sell. You have revenue goals to meet. How do you disguise a strong call to action without having it feel like a sales pitch?
So we don't disguise things. I've been really bullish about us being extremely transparent with our partnerships. And so example being, we work with Scotch, like 3M, on gift wrap techniques. And, that's a pretty easy thing to hide, right? Like it can be in the materials and so on. But that's sort of like against my philosophy. I want to be like, Scotch paid us to wrap amazing gifts and show you all these badass tutorials that you can do with really affordable materials, and we're stoked to do it. And I think if you're trying to hide, obviously, the partner that you're working with, well, everyone needs revenue, but maybe there's a different way you need to bring that partnership to life.
What about just those calls to action that are to the audience, like, share this with your friends, share your story, that type of thing? How do you kind of keep those fresh and not just like white noise with all the other calls to action?
I mean, it's such a challenge, and one we're still trying to figure out ourselves. We've gone back and forth about having like enabling comments and this type of thing, and what is the point of someone sharing this? We actually just want them to know this story. So we really choose wisely, and I think that's part of why I use the writing solo example, because so many people had stories to share. But if it's, like a simply entertaining piece, they don't need to share it. It's okay. So I think sort of use the sharing wisely, and also think about the channel that's right for it. We used to always do like share on Twitter and Facebook and Pinterest and Instagram, and now we kind of choose one.
Very cool. It looks like we're getting close to the end, but I want to ask one more question. In terms of something actionable someone could do tomorrow to kickstart their content and storytelling, what's something you would suggest just day one that they could get started?
Yeah, so I would say start thinking about your brand as a human being. You know, think of your brand as a living, breathing entity that has to be nourished, that has opinions, that has a history, that has a favorite band from the 90s. You know, all of these things, and it can feel a little hokey, but I think it's a really great exercise to be, because your brand isn't always exactly your audience. Your brand isn't always exactly your founders. And so who is your brand as a person? And I think that can really help guide you in terms of finding your voice and this, and you know, creating those filters and guardrails for the types of stories that you do want to tell. And then I'd say the second part, which I sort of touched on earlier, is creating a calendar for yourself. Again, like you might only be creating a blog post once a month, but come up with the 12 months that you're doing and figure out how you're going to evaluate that stuff. What's the point of this? It's actually just that we want to share about our stuff. Okay. Or the point of this is we want more customer stories. Okay. You know, and really, again, even if you're on your own, treat yourself as an employee and come up with these kind of to-dos for yourself.
Awesome. I think that's the end of our time. That went really fast. But thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much for sharing.